Viktor Frankl said, "Everything can be taken from a man but one thing, the last of the human freedoms. To choose one's attitude in any given set of circumstances, to choose one's way. This is Finding Human with Sue Jackson. Stay tuned for the next hour as Sue explores the human psyche, what makes us tick, and how to live better, more fulfilled and more meaningful lives. Only on 101.9 High FM.
Hello, this is Sue Jackson on 101.9 High FM on the Finding Human program. And my guest today is Philip Weyers. Philip is retired now, but he ran his own very successful business and in South Africa. He is now an ex-South African. He's has moved to Brisbane. He's an entrepreneur. And when he was in South Africa, one of his passions was the South African Air Force. His son and his son-in-law are both very highly respected pilots. Now, Philip, unfortunately, like so many other South Africans, after a very violent home intrusion, Philip, his wife and his children left South Africa and relocated to Australia. But his love for what he calls the motherland is deep, and it runs in his veins. And he has been invited to give many inspiring talks in South Africa and elsewhere. Philip and I met on our way to Israel, and we realized we were both cousins. We had the same aunt and uncle, Yanni and Daphne Smuts, and the same cousins. So Philip is my cousin by marriage. Welcome, cuz. How are you today?
Good morning, cuz. How very good to see you. It would have been better in person, of course. And just a special word to all your listeners who might be having to endure me for not the first occasion, and thank you to them all. They flatter me.
They're looking forward to listening to you, cuz. Philip is a great friend of Israel and of Jews. His father was a judge with many Jewish friends. Just tell me a bit about your dad.
Cuz, my father went to Pretoria Boys High, as did I, many years later, and then followed the family footsteps and did a BA LLB in law at Tuckies in Pretoria, and then went to Cambridge, Christ's College in Cambridge, where he did an LLB, which was later upgraded to an LLM, and came back and practiced as an advocate at the Pretoria Bar, and then mid-1980s was appointed to the bench of what was then the Transvaal Provincial Division of the Supreme Court of South Africa, which is now obviously the High Court. And he too, like his father and like his grandfather, and like me, had a great love for Israel. They all visited Israel. The Obas only once, funny enough, in 1917. But I think that was formative for me, certainly. My dad had a number of colleagues on both the bar and the bench, and I actually made a list after we'd spoken previously. If I recall correctly, the Honourable Mr. Justice Oscar Galgut had admitted my father to the bar.
Yes.
Which would have been probably in the late 50s. And subsequent to that, his son, Judge Brian Galgut, who was a judge on the Transvaal Provincial Division as well, and he used to on occasion take me back to Boys High from the city centre. Ezra Goldstein, the father of the chief rabbi.
Right.
I remember him well, and I actually went to the home one evening where I met who the chief rabbi was to become the chief rabbi, and his elder brother, I think elder brother Saul.
Yeah, and Warren is the chief rabbi.
Warren, absolutely. In another colleague, which is an interesting little twist to it, was Judge Maya Joffe, whose cousin we met at Ramat Yochanan kibbutz, where he's known as Maya Joffe, and he's a cousin of Judge Maya Joffe. And then I think my dad's favorite, or the one to whom he was closest, and they were very good social friends, was Judge Henry Price. And I knew him as an advocate. and he used to flatter me as a child by asking me what car I thought he should buy. And I said, well, why don't he be like my dad and buy a Mercedes? And my dad, actually, that was something that I remember today still. My dad then explained to me why it was very difficult for some Jewish people to buy German products and German cars. And that's that. I mean, that goes back probably not much less than 60 years.
Wow.
And I remember that. And Judge Henry Price was in my parental home one evening, where he asked if he could use the phone before the days of cell phones. And I said, of course, Judge, come along and I'll show you. So I took him through to my dad's study where there was a phone, and he said to me, Philip, how long have we known each other? So I said, well, Judge, 45 years or whatever the case was at that time. And he said, well, don't you think you should maybe call me Henry? And I said, no, I don't think so, Judge.
It just didn't feel right.
No, not at all.
You know, that actually reminds me of a story that you told when we were going through Smuts' house in Irene about the domestic worker who worked for General Smuts and Omar Smuts, and all the children called her Auntie Tanny. Is that right?
Her name was Annie Morpher King.
Mm-hmm.
And other than the Obas and Omar, everybody addressed her as Mrs. Morpher King.
Oh, Mrs. Morpher King.
Yeah, she was addressed as Mrs. Morpher King by the children, by the grandchildren, and only the Obas and Omar addressed her as Annie. It was also her that on the night following the Obas' death in 1950, it was Annie who sat down next to Omar, who was crying on her bed, put her arm around her and said, you got to deal with this, because it was right that the Obas went first, because he would not have had the strength to deal with your having gone first.
Oh, gosh.
And that's, and just an interesting quirk there, Sue, just an interesting thought that I've thought of for many years, is that Annie, had the Obas had been an out-and-out racist, as another article I read recently, that would not have occurred.
No,
they would not have insisted, and it wasn't Annie's insistence, it was the Obas and Omar's insistence that she be addressed as Mrs. Morpher King. That is not what a racist does.
And she would also never have been able to sit down next to Omar Smuts and put her arm around her.
Far from it. And that was Obas a paternalist? Absolutely. He believed, I think, fairly strongly that there was a learning process to go through, a learning curve to be able to govern. And on that basis, I think he's obviously viewed as a racist. I don't think so. I don't think he was ever racist. I think he was a paternalist. His caring for humanity as a whole would have not permitted that. But I think Africa as a continent will prove right what he envisaged or what he considered in those days. Not least of all South Africa still today, to be honest.
Absolutely. South Africa today is definitely a part of that. Okay, I'm just going to get back to you shortly.
This is Finding Human with Sue Jackson, only on 101.9 High FM.
Hello, this is Sue Jackson on the Finding Human program on 101.9. My guest today is Philip Weyers, and if you'd like to contact us, please do so on 34519, or you can telegram us on 061 895 1019. Philip and I would like to dedicate this program to all the hostages held for more than 103 days, and to their relatives and friends and all who have lost loved ones in the 6th of October massacre, Hamas massacre. To all the injured, to the IDF soldiers putting their lives at risk to save Israel from the likes of the Hamas monsters, we are thinking of you and praying for your safe return home. You know, Philip, you and I were going to talk about the ideological aspirations of the United Nations. Now, we chose the United Nations because General Smuts, your grandfather, was involved with the founding of it. Would you like to tell us a bit about that?
Sue, it in fact goes back a few years. In 1918, the Obas wrote a book, The League of Nations, A Practical Suggestion. That was preceded by his proposal to both houses of Parliament in the UK for the establishment of what we now know as the Commonwealth of Nations. He had this whole, I think it formed part of his holism, his holistic approach to life, and his holism thoughts. Excuse me. And as we know, the League of Nations came into being, and it was through the League of Nations that the OBOS was able to, largely his doing, make good on the Balfour Declaration that England had issued in 1917, in which hadn't yet been implemented. And after the First World War, and the Ottoman Empire had been defeated, at the San Remo conference, he proposed what came to be known as the Smith Proposal, which was the mandate system as we know it. And South Africa, as we'll remember, got a C-class mandate over then Southwest Africa, and England was given a Class A mandate over what was then known as Palestine. And it was on that basis that England was able to make good on her undertakings of the Balfour Declaration. And of course, it wasn't that simple leading up to 1948. Every time a boatload of Jewish refugees or immigrants to their ancestral homeland took place, the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem got his bloomers into a real bunch and protested violently. There were protests all over. Jews were murdered during those immigration times.
And ships were sent back to Germany.
Oh, absolutely. And you know, it all became quite ridiculous at the end. The Jewish immigrants were permitted to have firearms, but not bullets. And when I was in Israel, when we were there for the Balfour Declaration centenary, a very dear friend, Joel Klotnick, took me to the Ayalon Institute, which was an underground bullet manufacturing facility.
Yeah. And
that was how they circumvented that. And there was stairs going down and a lift coming up, all hidden behind a baker's oven. There was a bakery and a laundry. And the unwitting British soldiers used to take and buy bread and have their laundry carried out, unknown to them that right below their feet, bullets were being manufactured.
And I suppose the noise was hidden by the washing machines.
Absolutely, absolutely, and the ovens. And I'm happy to say, which I take as a mark of small achievement, that when I was there, I posted a photo of the bullet factory, underground bullet factory at the Ayalon Institute, on Google.
Yeah.
And it's now had 3.5 million views.
Oh my gosh, is that so? That's amazing. You're famous, Phil.
Absolutely.
I've got a famous cousin.
When I told Joel that I'd had, what was at that stage, 1 million views, he said, well, that's not good enough. No, come on.
Push it.
Push it. So and then Second World War, of course, happened, which was, well, let me just get back to the League of Nations. The League of Nations failed because Woodrow Wilson was defeated and America pulled out, and it came to naught. But the provisions of the Class A mandate over Palestine stood because they had been ratified into international law. And so the League of Nations came to naught at the end of it, which I think was a great disappointment to the OBOS. And then after the Second World War, he was quick, along with other leaders at the time, to propose the formation of another body. He was determined that there would not again be the enormous death and casualties that were suffered in both the First and Second World Wars. And San Francisco, 1945, he was largely responsible for the drafting of the preamble to the Charter, where, in fact, he coined the phrase human rights, the Declaration of Human Rights.
Oh.
And interestingly, which I only learned relatively recently from the late Colonel Charles Comley, the veto that the permanent members of the Security Council enjoy was a proposal of the OBOS.
Oh.
No veto, no Russia, no United Nations.
Huh.
And of course, the permanent members, particularly Russia, China, and thank heavens, America, have used the veto on a number of occasions. America very recently. Thank heavens for that.
Phil, just hang on. We're going to get back to you. Okay. We're going to get back to Phil in a minute. It's just that he suddenly froze, and apparently this has been happening most of the day, and it's been happening everywhere, even at my house, I must admit. You know that when the United Nations came into being, there was excitement about it, that there would be more openness, less wars, but it hasn't worked out that way.
This is Finding Human with Sue Jackson, only on 101.9 High FM.
Hello, this is Sue Jackson on the Finding Human program. My guest today is Philip Weyers. We're having a bit of a problem with connection. I think it's everywhere actually in Johannesburg at the moment. Hello, Phil, can you hear me?
Hi, Sue. Yep, got you fives. Have you got me?
Can't hear him talking. Okay, Phil, now say it again, please. How are you?
I'm good, thanks. Sue, can you hear me now?
Yes, I can. Sorry about that.
Okay. No
Philip,
problem.
you know, one of the other things we wanted to talk about, and I see that we're going to have to go into it because of wasting time with this hitch, was how so often enemies become friends, which we don't often think, especially in a time of war, which is what's happening at the moment with Israel and Hamas and Ukraine and Russia. There was a time when Germany, the Nazis, killed 6 million Jews and millions of other people, and yet they're the ones standing up with us now for genocide. Now, you know, I was thinking about your grandfather, General Smuts, and he had some very strange friends. Tell me about his relationship with Churchill. I mean, he put him into jail, and then so in the Boer War. Just tell us a bit about Churchill.
Sue, as you know, Winston Spencer Churchill was a correspondent during the Boer War, and was on a train that was the rails were blown up, and he was taken captive and imprisoned in Pretoria, where he protested vehemently, saying that he was a war correspondent, and the boss is responsible. Why are you there wearing a sidearm? Why are you armed if you're a correspondent? Mm-hmm. And he was jailed and went to great lengths to escape, where he got out of his, it wasn't a cell by any stretch, he got out of his, where he was being held, and swam the mighty Arpies River. And in fact, I told his granddaughter, the Countess Charlotte Peel, I said, you know, I hate to disappoint you, but the Arpies River at most times is about 10 foot wide and about 6 inches deep, so there wasn't a heck of a lot of swimming involved. But they became acquainted with each other after the Boer War, when Churchill started gaining prominence in England, and the Obos was on a mission to get as much self-governance as he could for South Africa. And they developed, with the passage of time, a friendship. Churchill was very supportive of the Obos. And there's a number of stories. The best collection of stories, in fact, would probably be the book by Richard Steyn. They became very, very dear friends, and the Churchill consulted with the Obos extensively and continuously. Whenever there was something big on the go during the Second World War, Churchill would cable the Obos and ask him for his thoughts and comments. And whenever it was possible, they would meet, if not in England, then, for example, 1942 in Cairo. And
our Uncle Yanni was with them. Our Uncle Yanni was with him.
Absolutely.
He was
Uncle Yanni was his ADC.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And Churchill went to the extent of saying that his Lodestar aircraft was not suitable for intercontinental travel, and gave him an Avro York, which is a far larger four-engined aircraft with four Rolls-Royce Merlin motors. And interestingly, that during the Second World War, they were sitting one evening and they had a good laugh because Churchill mentioned his escape during the Boer War, and the Oberst chuckled away and said, well, you actually needn't have bothered because I was going to release you anyway the following day. So the escape in fact was for naught.
And then he also, didn't Churchill also appoint him as Prime Minister if something went wrong with Churchill? What was that story?
Well, there are a lot of stories about that. In fact, it wasn't constitutionally possible for Churchill to do that, being a democracy, England. And basically what happened was when Churchill went to Yalta with FDR, with Roosevelt, and to meet Stalin, one of the other great villains of all time, the Oberst sort of chaired the war cabinet. So from a practical point of view, he was in charge. From a theoretical point, not. The reality was that he had probably more input and more objective input into what was being waged at the time in 1942 than the chiefs of the arms of service. So, and he was older than them, obviously, as well. So he sort of ran the meetings in Churchill's absence, but there was nothing official about it.
Amazing. We're going to get back to their Churchill and Smuts in a moment.
This is Finding Human with Sue Jackson, only on 101.9 High FM.
Hello, this is Sue Jackson on the Finding Human program. My guest today is Philip Weyers, and we're talking about Churchill and Smuts' relationships and how you can go from an enemy to a trusted friend. You know, Churchill's doctor, later Lord Moran, wrote in his diary, Smuts is the only man who has any influence with the Prime Minister. Indeed, he's the only ally I have impressing counsels of common sense on the Prime Minister. The Smuts sees clearly that Winston is irreplaceable, that he may make an effort to persuade him to be more sensible. And then it went on to say many insiders witnessed Smuts' influence in amazing ways. Churchill used to have his meetings at all different hours of the day and night, and he was beaten at this game once when this is what was happening to him. A typical evening would be drinks at 8:30, dinner at 9, brandy and cigars at 10:15, joining the ladies at 10:40, film at 11, and then work from 1 until 3 a.m., Mountbatten recalled. Churchill was beaten at this game once, the only time I ever saw him defeated. At about 1 o'clock, Winston said, well, now we will start work. No, we won't, said Smuts. I am not going to be a party to your murdering the British Chiefs of Staff. Here they are. They have to be back in the office by 9 o'clock in the morning, ready for meetings at 9:30. You will still be lying in bed with a fat cigar dictating to your secretary. They have to work all morning and all afternoon. In the afternoon, you have a siesta. You bring them down here, make them work all nights as well. You'll kill them, and I'm not going to be a party to that. He then got up and he went to bed. There was absolute silence for a minute. Nobody spoke. And suddenly Winston Churchill got up and said, well, perhaps we'd better go to bed. It was the only time we were ever let off. I love that story. Isn't it gorgeous? That was the influence he had.
There was a movie, Sue, called Churchill, which I watched, and it upset me tremendously because the Oberst is portrayed as a lackey. You know, when Churchill didn't want to, in the movie, when Churchill didn't want to get out of bed one morning, Clementine told the ADC to get hold of Smuts and get him to come and get Winston out of bed. And I was so upset by that, I actually got hold of Richard Stein. I said, Richard, is this true? I mean, he's just a lackey in this. And Richard Stein said, forget you ever saw the movie. He says it is absolute rubbish.
Oh, is that so?
So that made me feel better, yeah.
I'm sure. And, Churchill also wrote him, said that Churchill shut himself away in his bedroom for half a day to compose a letter to Mrs. Izzy Smuts, whom he had never met. To an unversed reader, it may seem a little bit overdone. Knowing Churchill as we do, we can be in no doubt that it was a genuine, heartfelt expression. This is what he said. Please accept my deepest sympathy in your sorrow and deprivation. I know how vain are words in such sadness, and how much worse it is for those who stay than for those who go. And then he went on to say that how the world had lost a great warrior, statesman, and a philosopher. So that was what Churchill thought of his very, very good friend. Now, Phil, you mentioned a Paul von Letterforbeck. I've never heard of him, because you said he was also one of the ones who could have been an enemy and then became a trusted person. Who was he?
Sue, that is an interesting story. In 1915, the Obas and Louis Botha went to drive the Germans out of Deutsche Südwest Africa, which they accomplished fairly quickly. Vast country, but the defensive capability of the Germans wasn't great, so they quickly dispensed with them. It's also the first time that South Africa ever used an aircraft in wartime, which was for reconnaissance purposes. And the Obas was then sent to German East Africa.
So this was World War One, was it?
World War One, 1916. Mm-hmm. And he went off to German East Africa, where his adversary was General Paul von Letterforbeck. And he chased von Letterforbeck all around the country. He managed to drive him out of what was then Tanganyika. But never defeated him, never captured him, and in fact the only thing he caught, and an enormous number of his soldiers, was malaria, which troubled him to the end of his life. But they became friends. They corresponded, and during the Second World War, von Letterforbeck, who was a Kaisersman, he was never a Nazi, and was heard that von Letterforbeck was literally starving and freezing to death in his apartment in Berlin. So the Obas arranged to the International Red Cross that aid packages would be delivered to von Letterforbeck, and which they were. And von Letterforbeck, in fact, having survived the war, the Second World War, visited the big house in Irene.
Oh, did he?
As did another of the Obas' great friends, Chaim Weizmann. He also visited the house in Irene, and that one leads me onto Weizmann, who the Obas first met in 1917, and they, I think, were matched intellectually, or it's been said they were. Chaim Weizmann being a brilliant physicist who invented and developed an explosive that was critical to the British and Allied war effort. And they became friends, and Weizmann had in the Obas a conduit directly into the Imperial War Cabinet at that stage. So he could sound off ideas on the Obas, and the Obas, if they were of merit, which I'm sure they were, would have raised the matters with the War Cabinet. And that would likely have had quite a bearing on the issuing of the Balfour Declaration then. Peter Bailey, our mutual, very dear friend in Israel, wrote an article, Smuts, the Forgotten Man Behind the Balfour Declaration. That he doesn't feature in it at all in terms of the publications about the Balfour Declaration, but he certainly had vast influence over its drafting and, in fact, the issuing of the declaration.
And you were actually welcomed at the Knesset when they heard who you were.
Yeah, I was, by the Deputy Speaker, Hilig Bar, in those days. And we all sat in the Knesset in the gallery where he welcomed me. And I didn't understand a word, because you have those speakers to translate.
Yeah.
And they were no longer particularly comfortable on my ears, and so I took them off. And then I heard my name in Hebrew.
Yeah.
So the only one amongst us who spoke Hebrew was Beryl Klotnik. I said, Beryl, what's he saying? And she then translated for me. So that is a lifetime experience. I mean, it really was.
Absolutely. And Philip, now when I look around the world and I see so-called genocide in many, many places that has been there, Darfur, the Rohingya Muslims in Myanmar, I wonder why we are the ones getting the flack. I'm going to get back to that in a moment.
This is Finding Human with Sue Jackson, only on 101.9 High FM.
Hello, this is Sue Jackson on the Finding Human program, and my guest today is Philip Weyers, and Philip and I are related through marriage, and so and he has immigrated to Australia. It's just so nice connecting with him. Philip, just tell me, when you look around the world, the Darfur atrocities, the different ethnic cleansing that's going on, why do you think it's always Israel? I read something the other day, no Jews, no news.
I think it is. I think you've answered that really. I think it is very simply because Israel is Jewish. It's as simple as that. Thomas Sowell did an interview many years ago, which I happened to pick up on YouTube recently, and the interviewer asked him, what must the Jews of the world do to be more accepted and more liked? And Thomas Sowell had a very simple answer. He said, they must fail. And I think that is absolutely true. That sort of leads me on to the current situation, where I have always been aware that there's sort of like a subliminal degree of anti-Semitism in South Africa. And the current events following 7 October have actually drawn a lot of anti-Semites out. There's one lady who, I won't mention her name, but she was a very prominent advocate working for an organ of state, and retired, and was followed by an absolute disaster in the same position. And she went absolutely berserk on what must be the most venomous place to be on all the earth, which is X, what used to be called Twitter, and decrying Israel's actions in Gaza. And eventually, when she was pushed, and she had to be pushed, she said that the October 7th massacres were quote-unquote horrible. And I sent her a message back and I said, is that really the best that you can do? And she was a person that I had enormous respect for. And, I just don't understand it. As I say, I've known there's been an undercurrent of anti-Semitism in South Africa for years, not least of all in the National Party. But it suited them to be friends with Israel for things like the 707 project, the G5, the G6 cannon, the field guns, and the Larby project, and so on. But the current bunch are just absolutely venomous, and I take this all terribly personally. I really do. I knew I'd be affected by it, but not to the degree that I have been. I get so angry and so hurt by what people say about Israel, Israel was extraordinarily kind to me, about Jews, and I have a cousin who's Jewish, as you know. You probably know her name, Sue Jackson. And my friends in Israel, it pains me enormously. I've never known anything other than kindness, generosity, and consideration from Jewish people at large, specifically my friends and relatives. And it just pains me that there's a PhD who in human sciences or something is also far too active on X, and also totally opposed to Israel. And I've thought of saying to her, you've come out of the closet now as an anti-Semite. And And the reality is, just really quickly, that I know more about the history of Israel and the history of the Palestinians probably than most people. I've worked very hard at finding out about it, done a lot of research. I have good friends and family who have taught me about it. And I just don't understand why these people don't go and read a bit themselves. It's easy. Go to Google and you'll find the history there.
Absolutely.
It'll tell you that Israel was not responsible, nor were the Jews, for Gaza. You know,
we handed Gaza over.
That's right, 2005. And guess what's happened? Yeah, absolutely.
You know, there is selective outrage, quite honestly, that I'm seeing. But, you know, Hillel Fuld on LinkedIn said, at least our enemies are coming out. The ones we thought were our friends are suddenly showing their true faces, and we can see who they are. We're not befooled again. You know, I must admit that I see the faces of the Palestinian children, confused, terrified, bloodstained, dirty, you know, and then I see the children who have been kidnapped, the children who have been had to witness atrocities in the south by the massacre, the Hamas massacre, and my heart absolutely breaks. There are times that I actually can't even contain that pain that I'm feeling for the world at the moment. And you ask, where are the voices of reason? You know, they've just brought out this video of Hamas saying that 2 more hostages are killed. It's pure psychological torture that they're doing, and no one speaks out about it, least of all our government.
Absolutely, you know, and the irony to me too, if you understand the 1948 definition of genocide, which is a word created to describe the Holocaust. There was no word that described the horror of the Holocaust sufficiently, and the I'm trying to think who it was, coined the phrase genocide. Genocide is the systematic destruction and elimination of a race or a people. That is not what Israel's doing. It is not what they are doing. And if you understood that, but then, you know, if you're going to be an anti-Semite, even if you're an South African intellectual anti-Semite, the rules of war as they stand, to which Israel complies, and genocide with which Israel is not engaged, will mean nothing. They are still going to nail Israel, and it is simply because Israel is Jewish. I think that's the bottom line, because even at school, you know, at Boys High, there were the Kaplan brothers that my father was at school with, AKJ, Arthur Kaplan Jewelers. It was D. Meyer and Company that my mother used to go and shop at. Jewish. Pick and Pay.
Exactly,
Jewish.
Phil, I'm being told to actually wrap up. It's a pity because we've got so much more to talk about. I will be in contact with you afterwards, and we can make another time if that's okay with you. Unfortunately, because of the cutoff, we lost, I think, about 15 minutes of our time together. But I think we have covered quite a lot. We've got a song coming up which will not come through on podcast. It's a beautiful song you're going to be listening to now. Thank you, Judy Erwick from Australia, for sending it.